Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you. Um, I would just like to check if I am audible. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear.
Joy, we hear you. This is Carmen, but you're
All right.
breaking up a little. So we'll try this, but if you continue to break up, maybe we'll have to have your screen off in a little bit.
All right, Carmen. Thank you so much,
Thank
Carmen.
you.
So I just switched off my screen. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome back to the session of the Global School. Today, we will be beginning a very exciting class and our first session with Columbia University. We have with us Professor Elarza Barkan and also Professor Elsa, who will be joining us for today's session. So welcome, dear professors, to today's session. Thank you for taking the time to be with us here today. As tradition at FIMI, we always begin with an invocation program. So for today, I would like to invite Brittany from Latin America to kindly lead us with her invocation. Over to you, Brittany.
Hermanas, con todas, muy buenos días.
Sisters, welcome and good morning, everyone. To start the day today, here in Latin America, perhaps it's very early in the morning, but perhaps you're ending your day. So we're going to start first by thanking God and the earth, first of all, for the life that they give us and for the food that the earth provides us, for their care, and for offering us all of the nature that we have around us to continue living here. So we're going to start with a prayer, and you can also pray at your homes, asking for what you would like for you, for the people you love, for these classes.
Voy a estar orando.
And also so that everything goes well. So I'm going to start praying. Thank you, God, for the life that you give us and for this day. Today, I would like to thank you for providing us with health, with food, nourishment, and care. I also want to ask you to give us strength, patience, and perseverance for these courses that we are doing right now that will be helpful in the future. Let's not leave the knowledge that we're receiving just with us, so that we can share that knowledge and that way help other people, help our peoples who need it. Give us wisdom and the strength to continue down a good path and to continue being strong, being patient, and give us also resilience. I'd like to show you a little bit about my land. This is the coca leaf. When we make an invocation or what we call a payment to our earth, we have a glass with wine and another one with alcohol to ask for wishes with the coca leaf. So I'm going to do that today so that everything goes well. That is all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brittany, for opening today's session and for
Muchas
that very
gracias,
enlightening. Hello. Thank you, Brittany, for your invocation. Moving forward, I would like to introduce you to our expert for today's session, Professor Elarza Barkan, who Professor of the International and Public Affairs and the Director of the Human Rights Concentration at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. Professor Barkan was the director of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights from the year 2008 to 2022. He was also the founding director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation. Previously, he worked and served as chair of the History Department and the Cultural Studies Department at the Claremont Graduate University, where he was the founding director of the Humanities Center. A historian by training with a PhD from Brandeis University, his research interests focus on human rights and on the role of history in contemporary society and politics, and the response to gross historical crimes and injustice. His human rights work seeks to achieve conflict resolution and reconciliation by bringing scholars sides of a conflict together and employing historical methodology to create shared narratives across political divides. A pertinent article, Historians and Historical Reconciliation, American Historical Review, October 2009. Professor Barkan's other current research interests also includes refugee repatriation, comparative analysis of historical commissions, shared sacred sites, and the question of human rights impacts, specifically with regards to redress and traditional justice. Professor Barkan will be talking to us today on the historical dialogue, memory projects, and engaging communities with future-oriented perspectives. Welcome, Professor Barkan. And just as an information to the entire class, Professor Barkan will be speaking to us, after which we will then have a question and answer round with him. So over to you, Professor Barkan. Welcome. Thank you for being with us here today.
Good morning or good evening, wherever you are. I'm very pleased to be with you today. And I would like us to, I have a couple of questions before. First of all, how does the translation work?
Yes, Professor, we have the Spanish translation with us today.
I unfortunately don't speak Spanish, so how do I respond to questions and discourse from the Spanish-speaking participants?
Professor, there'll be below your screen, there is a globe-like icon. If you click there, you'll see there is an option for Spanish and English interpretation. So you can switch on the Spanish. You can tap on the Spanish option.
Where is it?
Below the screen, if you're using your laptop, it's below the screen. There's an icon that looks like a globe, Professor.
Joy, this is Carmen. Professor
Yes.
Barkan would have to choose the English language.
Sorry,
And he
the
will hear
English.
the English interpretation when a participant speaks in Spanish. So not the Spanish option, but the English option. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen.
I'm not sure that I can see that. I'm sorry.
Professor Barkan?
Yes.
Do you see at the very bottom of your screen, there's a round circle with lines. We're calling it like a globe, but it's a round circle with some lines representing sort of like a globe. If you click on it, a little menu will open up and it has the option English or Spanish, that's for your language. Can you see that?
No, I don't see. I see mute, start video, and more.
Okay, click on more.
I do.
Okay, when you click on more, did you see language interpretation? I think
No,
perhaps you're in
your interpretation. Yes, I
Are
can
you on
see.
a phone or on a computer?
No, in the computer, I can see that. Give me a second.
Okay.
Yes, I can see that. It says English.
Okay, select English, and that way you will always hear either the English speaking from English speakers, as well as the interpretation from us when there's a contribution or a question from a Spanish speaker. So you should be okay.
Very well. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Let us know if you have any problems. Thanks.
Okay. So welcome again. And I would like to conduct this seminar interactively. I don't want to lecture and then get the answer questions. I prefer to have you interrupt me and I'll ask questions. And I'd like you to answer from your own experience. So what we are going to talk about today is about identity. And how is our identity involved with human rights? This is important because we know very well that our identity, who we are, is essential to our understanding of society and politics. Just a second. Yeah. So who we are is very much a constructed ideology, is a constructed description. And to start with, being indigenous is not always clear to who is indigenous and who is not indigenous. And we can hopefully ask Professor Elsa Stepanopoulou to tell us about the human rights indigenous building in the UN. But to describe the indigenous over the years, they've developed a lot and became a powerful voice for a lot of people who were avoided and neglected. It's a relatively new field. And people become stronger with the involvement of human rights. As you will know probably, reparation and redress is a relatively new concept. There have been some older cases, for instance, an attempt to compensate, to repair slavery at the end of the American Civil War, 1865. There was a proposal, a policy to give every freed slave 40 acres so they can do their work. And what's unique about that is that it was one of the early attempts to compensate people who suffered not because the perpetrators were forced to leave to do it, but because the victors saw that this is just. Until the end of World War II, which is 1945, there were no reparations and no interest in supplementing, in repairing crimes against humanity, genocide. At the end of World War I, the reparations were imposed on Germany, and the reason people thought were the reasons for the outbreak of World War II. So the payment after World War II were to build Germany back and to build Japan back rather than punish them. Can I hear from you if you understand what I'm saying? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can follow you, Professor.
Okay, thank you. So World War II included the Holocaust. The Chancellor of Germany in 1948, when West Germany became independent again, believed that for Germany to be part of the international order, they had to pay reparations. They had to come to an agreement with the worst victims, which were the Jews and subject to the Holocaust. And so, within 5 years of the founding state of Israel in West Germany, there were negotiations, and Germany provided compensation for Jews and for Israel. And nobody forced Germany to do it. Germany did it of its own goodwill, because turning away for crimes that they did in the past became an important component of their identity. It's important to notice, to pay attention, that what today is considered the worst genocide, the worst infliction of atrocities, both the perpetrators and the victims managed to agree on compensation, and that meant that for the next 50, 60, 70 years by now, the relationship between the two entities were built on reparation. Does anyone have any questions so far?
Sisters, if you have any questions for Professor, please kindly just unmute yourself or raise your hand and go ahead.
I don't see anybody, so you will have to call it.
Um, There's no one as of now, Professor.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at the end of World War II, it's one of the conventional agreement is that human rights started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It took many years, but human rights suddenly developed and evolved, and we can say that in 1970s was a big push forward. And that's the time that human rights became an important component of policies of colonial powers. And it was understood that who we are is who we were. If we wanted to have human rights at the present, there needed to be also human rights in the past. We needed to address crimes that were perpetrated before. And that's about the time that indigenous people started to be politically active. If you look at places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, these were all places where negotiations and discussion of bringing indigenous people to the fore took place. So redress began to be discussed, especially in those countries. First of all, does anyone come from their purpose, from their history? They have experience of discussing redress with their dominant culture.
Professor, could you please repeat the question?
Yes, I wanted to know if there is anybody among the audience who experienced negotiation about their status as indigenous people with the country in which they live. Is that clear?
Yes. Yes, Professor. Sisters, I would just like to ask if you can hear the question, and if you can hear Professor Barkan as well. He would like to know if any one of us has ever been part of negotiations in our countries with regards to the status of indigenous peoples, if we've had any kind of dialogues within our areas of work. So any one of you would like to share?
Is that a concept that is familiar to the audience? Redress
Yes.
or not?
Yes, Professor, today is actually our first session with Columbia University. We've had a session earlier on cultural rights. We've only had 2 sessions because the class just started this week. So we had one session on cultural rights with Sandra Prima and another session on individual and collective rights with Maria Eugenia. But our participants have been actively involved in advocacy in their communities. But maybe I will just hand over the floor to any one of you if you would like to say something, any comment, or if you would like to share anything in this regard. Anima, please go ahead.
Hello, good evening from India. My name is Anima, and hello, Professor. I just wanted to share, and I don't know if it's quite relevant. Now, I'm in the state which is called Tripura. It's a part of Northeast India, and we belong to a indigenous community, which is Tripuri community. So, like when you mention about the dominant culture, so over here in my place also we have a dominant culture, and our population is you know uh, going very low now, in the last 70 years, when our state came into existence with the country India. So now our population is going down, and when you mention about negotiation, I think we are in the state of negotiation now. What will be, the condition of our community in the coming years, if we are looking for a solution here, wherein because we have people coming from Bangladesh in our state, and because of which the indigenous community is going down. So looking at that, the negotiation seems to be a little bit tough. We are still, I think, in the discussion at the moment. So probably I would like to understand more in that kind of situation. Uh, as per your experience, more understanding may come to me as well. How do we negotiate, or what would be the right kind of dialogue, and how can we bring that to UN as well, if it's relevant or not? So thank you.
Thank you. Janeri? Anybody else? Okay, I'll continue, assuming that you will tell me.
Yes, yes. I can see Jollery unmuting your mic. Would you like to say something? Um, Professor, I think Jollery might be having some network issues. Uh, we can just
Okay, so I'll
go ahead.
continue. So, dialogue. I think to answer the question, I think there is an important component to understand what dialogue is. And this is particularly important for redress. Dialogue is not just conversation between two groups that engages each other. It's also presenting the history of one of the victims as a group, even if not negotiations are going on, but that becomes an important component of who the victims see themselves as and who the perpetrators and how the perpetrators address the victims. For instance, in Australia, the recognition that the Aborigines lived there for 60,000 years came as a result of persuading the Australian government by the Aborigines and by human rights activists that this was not terra nullius, that this was not empty country before the white settler. And this developed, evolved, and was legislated after it was accepted by the judicial system. So activism led to a lawsuit, led to recognition. In New Zealand, it took a different format. New Zealand has a treaty which they did with the British settlers, the Maori people. And while the Maori are not indigenous, because they also migrated to New Zealand 400-500 years ago, they came to represent the early, what we call now indigenous. May I suggest this week there is a very interesting article in the New Yorker, substantive article on the evolution of the indigenous people category of who is included and who is excluded. I would strongly urge, for those of you who can read in English, try and read it. The connection to human rights is essential. And while there is a lot of criticism of human rights, it is only within the language of rights that indigenous were able to develop their standing. The UN, and I hope Professor Elsa will talk with you about the way in which the Indigenous Human Rights Forum in the UN evolved. But this dialogue empowers more groups to come to the fore. If I understand correctly, there are 500 million people who claim to be Aborigine, Indigenous, First People. More people required to be Indigenous than any other country besides China and India. So it's important to develop these and to recognize the plurality of human rights and indigenous people, because everybody is facing a different situation and their history and legacy is different. The only international ideology or policy that is accepted generally as human rights. Although democracies have fallen on hard times nowadays, still human rights is the only acceptable ideology, policy. And although people are supporting dictatorships and majoritarian rule, they do that in the name of democracy and human rights. And we need to struggle to get human rights the way we understood it. And to include the discourse of redress. It is really important the way that residential schools and reparation agreed upon by indigenous peoples in Canada and the US, and the way it's developed in each country differently. Is that clear? Joy,
Yes, yes, Professor.
is that clear? Do people have questions or observations of their encounter of redress? Even if the dialogue is not explicit dialogue, what do they do in order to pursue their rights?
So we have Bon. Bon, please go ahead.
Hi, Joy. Hi, Professor. Yeah, I think this question is of the administering powers recognizing Indigenous rights is really interesting in regards to the case of Guam, because specifically you brought up sort of this movement after World War II when the world starts to shift and recognize the case for like human rights in the form of, I think about in the form of reparations specifically because after World War II, Japan owed reparations to the people of Guam, but because of the peace treaty that America signs, America takes on that responsibility, but they never end up paying out those reparations to the people of Guam. So my grandma and everybody who survived the war, they never saw reparations before they passed away. And in fact, reparations for World War II didn't start getting paid out to the people of Guam until 2020, which was like maybe 3 years ago. And actually, the people of Guam had to fund our own reparations and then pursue reimbursements from the federal government in America. And I think it's interesting because there are all these formal processes that Indigenous people have to go to in order to be recognized by their colonizing powers. And for Guam, it's really a struggle of, as Indigenous people, we have to go through all of these channels in order to receive our human rights. And almost all of it, we face constant blockage because of our territorial status. So because Guam was never given an opportunity to pursue self-determination, I think like after World War II, all of these different entities, colonized territories became independent, but there are still 17 non-self-governing territories left in the world. And Guam being one of them, it's really hard to pursue human rights when as an Indigenous people, you still have territorial status and you're still under American power. It makes things like getting reparations and getting formal recognition on an international stage really difficult, because like in Micronesia, you have other small nations in the Pacific that have been able to lobby for more human rights. Like, for example, Palau after World War II, they struggled to get their independence. But because Guam is so heavily militarized and is so controlled by US military interests, I've felt that it's really difficult because every year Guam has a commission on decolonization that sends delegates to the UN to kind of plead our case and say, hey, we need to revisit our territorial status. We need to formally pursue the self-determination process. But every year, as our indigenous population shrinks, and every year as the Chamorro and indigenous interests in Guam is kind of battling with other settlers that are now taking over our island, it's I guess thinking about history and how it's played a role in slowing down our ability to assert our rights is really interesting, thinking about this conversation, because even something as that was supposed to be as simple as reparations took 40 years, or like 40 plus years, for the people of Guam to finally start seeing. So yeah, just thinking about what the professor was talking about today, and how important it is to be recognized as Indigenous people, and how important it is for that distinction, and how important it is to use that distinction in order to leverage rights. Yeah, I those were just the thoughts that I had.
Thank you. This is very important because it describes to us quite clearly the expansion of human rights which lead to redress. The fact that Guam demanded reparation for 40, 50, 60 years before it got any suggests that every country, every group has a different situation, and the more it's being discussed, the more likely there is getting attention globally, or at least within the form of indigenous, UN form of indigenous peoples. And we learn from each other. You said that you did beforehand cultural rights, Joy. Did you speak about museums and about human remains?
Yes. Winnie, if can you please answer Professor's question? I was not there in that particular class, Professor, that day, but my colleague Winnie, she was there. Winnie, if you can just give Professor, if you spoke about museums, and cultural rights. Or Sister Orte.
Buenos días. Todavía no se ha
Good
abordado
morning. No, that subject has not been talked about yet, specifically about museums, as part of the program and talking about human rights. So the issue of museums has not been presented yet or talked about, but since I've been given the floor right now, I'd like to add that I think it's a very important part. It's important to know the history. And here in Comalapa, in Guatemala, at the place where there was a massacre, where different people were killed at a national level. Now, as part of that redress process, and not because the Guatemala government asked for it, it's been asked by one of the women's organizations. Now, there is a part where people can come to find some comfort because the government never looked for an economic redress. And beyond that, I think that healing is the most important part of redress because that is what the soul, the spirit needs. The emotional part was not considered either. The issue of museums was not presented then, but looking at the experience in Guatemala, having a space where to meet with family members that were kidnapped and killed, that helps find closure for that pain. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you, Sister Orte. Professor, I can see Brittany's hand up as well. I'll just invite her to share.
Please do.
Brittany, please go ahead.
Sí. Mi consulta era para el profesor si
Yes, my question was for the professor. When can we start a process of redress? How can you start that? I'm asking this because currently in Peru, we are undergoing an economic and social crisis. There have been many deaths, and this is similar to events that have already happened in Peru that were categorized as terrorism. They killed everyone saying that they were terrorists. And the same is happening again after so many years.
ahora nosotros en
Now,
papel
on paper, we have written recognition from the communities in the countryside and from different ethnic groups. We have recognition for them in the laws on paper. But in practice, in reality, we don't see that these rights are actually being fulfilled. For example, a few years ago, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, in Peru, there was a manifestation, there was a protest rather. They wanted to use our mining resources. So there was a protest. This protest lasted a really long time in the southern area of Peru. And there was a leader. This leader had been guiding these acts because their community was the one that was going to suffer when these minerals were exploited. So in the southern area, there's a lot of unity. All of the communities, the Amara and Quechua communities are very united. And this leader was condemned to jail time simply because there were calls and he was coordinating these protests. And unfortunately, during this protest, there was a lot of criminal activities such as theft and different shops burning to the ground. So he was prosecuted. Now we see protests again, but they're coming about because of the discrimination carried out by the government towards people that are indigenous or from the countryside and don't really come from the areas of power or similar to the other leaders of Peru. So the state thinks that we are defending someone that maybe wasn't educated for their role, but that's not the case. People are rising up because we've experienced a lot of discrimination and racism against our communities. So they are now rising up because of everything that the government has done. And now it's been more than a month that we've been on strike. It's almost going to be 2 months. actually. We've had about 60 deaths in Peru, and all of these deaths are from the Aymara or Quechua regions. So how can we start a redress process when there has been so much harm perpetuated by the state? They haven't recognized our rights, and they've taken the lives of indigenous people and people from the countryside as if they were lesser than the lives of any other Peruvian citizen. This is the sad situation that we're undergoing here. The Peruvian state is allowing foreign institutions to come in and help us, but the state is only now starting to address this with other countries. They're saying that terrorism is starting again in our country. And this is an excuse. They're using terrorism. And it was a very sad period in our country beforehand, but they're using terrorism and attributing that to us while we're just protesting for our rights. And they're using history to fight against us. Right now, there's no leader guiding these protests. Why? Well, because we know that if there are leaders that do that, they'll be prosecuted. Sometimes they are killed, they are sent to jail. So we see this political persecution being carried out. And right now, our communities are so tired that there are no leaders and everyone is protesting, everyone is doing their own activities. And honestly, I think that a redress process would be very far off now. I don't know how it would be carried out in the previous situation with the terrorism. We still see that the legal processes are being carried out. It's been more than 40 years. And we see that all the people whose rights have been violated are still in that situation. They don't have any rights. They don't have a right to life, a right to be free, or to freely express themselves. All of these rights have been violated. Now the state has also declared a state of emergency, and we can't go out on the street because everything is militarized. So how could we start a redress or a reconciliation process with a state that is completely oppressing us and doesn't want a dialogue? When the state says that it wants a dialogue, it just treats us in a contemptful manner, and it tells us that we are not Peru, that we are just a minority. And those are
Okay.
the things that are happening here. So I would like to see if maybe you can tell us, how is it that a redress process can be started after a social crisis such as this one? That's all. Thank you.
Okay. This is all very interesting. And the first thing that we have to understand is the complexity of the different situations. And redress is possible, first of all, because it includes very many different things. It used to be, and that's why I asked about museums, it used to be that indigenous peoples were treated as part of the natural world, part of nature. And museums would display skeletons in their exhibit like it was animals, not recognizing that these are somebody's grandmother or grandfather. And that brought, so one way of redress in that regard was to move to NAGPRA, NAGPRA, North American Grave Protection Redress Act, in which the first recognition was to acknowledge that indigenous peoples were human, not part of nature. That happened in the 80s in the US. So cultural property became part of the redress. It has to be remembered or acknowledged. The museum held all kinds of religious artifacts, and the way of returning that to the people that own it was a very long process and very different in each situation. My understanding is that there are probably close to 6,000 languages in the world. I would say that 95% or more are indigenous languages, and recognizing those even without independence, even without sovereignty, was an important step in recognizing redress. So redress has everything to do, includes everything to do from joint histories, explaining how the history of indigenous people came to be dominated by colonial forces, and how different this situation in every country, certainly in different regions. It used to be most developed, most elaborate English-speaking colonies. But now, with Asia, Africa, and Latin America, when there are so many groups, this means that redress will take very different forms. As to Peru, it's a really sad situation, but the only thing I can imagine, and my imagination is very narrow, because I am learning from what happens in one place and apply it to another, but I don't know if I do it correctly. I think describing the history of indigenous people in Peru would be an important step in undermining the definition of all the indigenous peoples as terrorists. This kind of dialogue is not necessarily takes place when two parties talk to each other. It's always better if they do, but if they don't, the indigenous peoples have to describe their own history and to legitimize the narrative of their suffering. This is a long-term process. Sometimes the situation is different. Let me give you the example of Colombia, the country Colombia. When there was peace negotiations between the government and FARC, which took place in Havana, FARC demanded transitional justice processes, demanded to have a truth commission. I don't see now people, and I don't know whether they are familiar with truth commission or not. Joy, can you tell me?
Um, we've not had these sessions yet, Professor, but we will in the coming sessions.
Thank you. So there has been development since the 1980s of Truth Commission and demanding for reparation when countries move from dictatorship or from war to peace or democracy. Colombia and FARC were fighting each other, and FARC represented mostly the indigenous people, but it was considered to be terrorist. In the negotiations in Havana, they couldn't agree on transitional justice process, and if I hear Joy correctly, you will study transitional justice later, so I won't elaborate on it too much. But the FARC did not get its demands, and instead of that, they managed to agree with the government negotiators on a historical commission. And the historical commission took place of 6 months. And what's most interesting is they didn't come to an agreement on what the history is. Each side presented their own history, but that legitimized the FARC as a movement fighting for freedom, as a movement that represented people who suffered. And that meant that the FARC turned out to be members, partners of a dear dialogue, and not just terrorists. Their ideology, in their cases, their narrative was legitimized. So there was no agreement on redress, but the space of which the negotiation opened later was on a different platform, where the FARC was recognized as a legitimate partner. And then they moved into Truth Commission, into integrating the FARC into the society. There was a lot of failure there, but a lot of success as well. This, I think, is the closest to the Peru situation. And when Peru will have negotiations between the government and the indigenous people, this should be part of it. The process of transitional justice and historical dialogue should be part of it. That doesn't mean if we put it under the same umbrella as places that have divided, have included development of redress very extensively. This is obviously, and I mean New Zealand or Australia or Canada, this is obviously a different challenge. And we are trying to figure out in studying redress and historical dialogue, what can we learn from one case to another? Some cases it's very much developed and legitimized. In others, we are still very far from it. Is that clear?
Brittany, I hope that answers your question.
I wanted to know whether it was clear what I said.
Yes, we followed you, Professor.
Yes, it's clear.
The translation works well.
Sí, está funcionando.
Yes, it's working well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, indigenous redress is part of a larger redress globally. In the museums, we started to talk about skeletons and human remains and funerary material that was given back if the indigenous people wanted it. But since there is no indigenous process that is traditional of reclaiming human remains from a museum, many groups do not have the process to how to deal with it, and there are still a lot of human remains in many museums. Because when indigenous people try to study, to decide what to do from their own tradition, it's very difficult when you live in a world, in a modern world, that has different standards and different ways of handling things. And the redress in the museums, now we are going, not necessarily indigenous, but we are going to restitute a lot of its cultural objects that were in many museums, and this is part of a larger concept of colonial and post-colonial redress, reparation, restitutions. These are all words that used differently. So British museums, not just the British Museum, but other museums in UK are very much ahead of others in returning colonial, we can call it loot, colonial property that was taken from different places in the world. When England was, when the British Empire was very strong. But now, because of the redress situation and the legitimacy of human rights, people actually are willing to listen. And people who believe in human rights work towards an agreement, towards a restitution of a cultural property. Another important, very important view question of that is that we treat indigenous people as a category. And this is just very difficult to deal with it. The plurality among indigenous people is enormous. And there is no way of condensing it to one kind of policy or to one kind of presentation or demands. Each one is different, and the category of indigenous gives it more power, but we should be realistic of where we stand in each particular case and see what's appropriate demands and policies. Because the fact that many groups are not even at the stage of asking, let alone getting redress, should not necessarily be detrimental, because the discussion, even here, among different members of different groups, we let you know over the next few lectures, first, the next few discussions, we let you know how to deal with it or how is it dealt by others. The Indigenous Peoples Forum is an enormously important concept by our organization, and I am really impressed by how it operates because the groups are so different and still it is vibrant and it's developing. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it will happen in our lifetime, but the changes since over the last 50 years have been tremendous. And it needs a lot of patience and a lot of activities. Do people want to talk about? We should give a few minutes to people to say what they think, and then I will conclude by responding to that.
All right, Professor. Sisters,
I
if you
feel a
like.
little strange. I feel a little strange because I don't see the people.
Yeah.
And I wanted to have a conversation.
Yes, okay.
So you will do it.
So we have few cameras on now, sisters. Let's switch on our cameras for the last few minutes with Professor Barkan. Yeah. Yes, I think that's better, Professor.
If anybody wants to add from their experience.
Anima, you had a comment in the chat box. Would you like to read it out so that the interpreters can also translate that for other sisters?
Me, the one which I wrote in the
Yes.
chat box.
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay. That was just extension to what I shared earlier. You know, when Professor has mentioned about negotiation, and then later on he also emphasized on the museum thing, and I think he have also talked a little bit about historical dialogue, how we should process by starting with you know, the previous history. So I was just trying to process the similar thing through the chat, that in my state, the situation is that because the dominant group is so much in population right now, so the indigenous community have gone down to a very less number. So which means that the indigenous people do not have a proper job, or even the in terms of language education, you know, like our indigenous people not uh, talk, or they cannot comprehend the kind of language which is taught in the school, which is the other language. So all this scenario is somehow, when we get into activism, it is little difficult, what I feel. But through my chat, what I was trying to explain is that if probably you know, indigenous group can form a political wing, will that be more helpful to push in into the rights of the indigenous? So that was something which I wanted to understand. So that was what I was mentioning in the chat box.
Okay, I think to answer that, I think there is no one way in which we prescribe, because we are talking about what people are doing. And if some people are more inclined to do the politics, they should do the politics. But civil society, however difficult it is, and I appreciate that it's very, very difficult, the fact that I say it could be done doesn't mean to neglect the difficulties or to deny the difficulties that you're talking about. So I think it can go in two lanes that are parallel or not parallel, in which writing the history and describing the situation is essential to educate the wider public. And given the fact that India is in such a difficult situation altogether with the Hindu nationalists as dominating the country, and there is so little, in fact, of cultural openness, it will be difficult. So maybe people can do it and prepare it, and when Modi will lose eventually, it could be used to develop the cultural history as a description for future time. I don't know. There are so many castes and indigenous people that have different demands in India, and the law is not implemented in these terms. So it's very difficult to propose a specific route to go. There's so much violence against activists, whether these are Muslim activists, Dalit activists, indigenous people. The recognition is that everyone has to do what is most important to them and to acknowledge what is done by others. So maybe they can join forces or maybe not. But we are talking now about 70 years or 80 years since human rights started to become an international language. And the road ahead is still very long, very torturous. So I'm sorry I can't give you a solution, but I recognize I would like to take, if you will take something from this session, that first of all, over the long run, there is really a growing openness to indigenous peoples, and that so many groups or so many are operating differently, that it continues. Such seminars, for instance, in which you participate now, and you learn from other activists, you learn the situations by other people from all over the globe. I think this is second to none. I think it's incredibly important because we never know what would instigate understanding and reshaping of the understanding of people, one group from what another group is doing. I don't know if that's part of your syllabus, but I would say that studying what happened in British colonies with Australia, New Zealand, Canada would be very good, very important to see how people who were not recognized at all, what they did in order to get recognition. It's not independent, but it's very, very developed, very evolved. Anima, I see that you're shaking your hand, so nodding. So I assume you understood it.
Yes, sir, I did understand. And I'm also writing down that you mentioned to read some of the New Zealand and some of the other countries' struggle, how they have been fighting for recognition. So I'm noting it down and I'll make sure that I go through it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Joy, do we have others?
Yes, Professor. We have Juliana. Juliana, please go ahead.
Gracias, gracias,
Thank
profesor,
you. Thank you, Professor, for sharing all of this knowledge and for the experience that you shared with us this morning. This truly is an invitation to learn more about our history. As Indigenous communities, we've had different chapters of struggles. In countries such as Latin America, we know that colonialism started the invasion and has marked our existence as peoples. And then, as our sister Hortensia said, in Guatemala, we had an armed internal conflict. And this has also impacted the survival of our peoples. As a consequence, we had the process where we signed the peace agreements in Guatemala in one way or another that has brought issues with its compliance. We also had the recognition of Indigenous peoples. That agreement was signed on the identity of Indigenous peoples, and the state of Guatemala has not been able to truly fulfill the responsibilities of being able to respond to the needs of Indigenous peoples. We have different indicators that show us that we must continue to work on this. And if we unite as communities and as peoples, we'll be able to advocate and pressure in order to ensure that our rights are respected. We see the experiences in other countries, and that also helps us to be able to make our voice heard, particularly when it comes to the topic of Indigenous women. Throughout history, it's been a quite recent development that our voice is heard and that we are respected. And that also encourages us to continue learning and to join with our communities through our efforts and to continue to intervene as Indigenous women so that the new generation are able to have those new opportunities thanks to the doors that our ancestors opened. We are here and we will be able to continue to advance so that our identity and the recognition of our rights will continue to flourish. Thank you.
I'm happy if I'm happy but surprised that you described the situation, Juliana, in such optimistic terms. When I think of Guatemala, I think of the genocide of the indigenous people. So to hear that you feel that there is space to develop and that the situation is changing is heartwarming. So this is exactly a good example of where indigenous discussion globally enabled the group to focus on that situation in Guatemala and to provide some measure of comparison and to see, for people to start paying attention to indigenous peoples in Guatemala and not ignore it like they did 50 years ago. There is a lot of transitional justice in Guatemala and a lot of intervention in favor of the indigenous peoples from global players. So that is exactly the kind of power play and politics that informed by history and informs the history of the indigenous people. Thank you very much, Juliana.
Thank you, Juliana. Anyone else would like to share? Professor, I think we have another 10 minutes with you.
Okay.
So anyone else would like to share or reflect, comment, or have a question for Professor Barkani?
Well, I'll say that what we have heard today from some of the participants very much represent the situation today. Redress is intimately related to democracies, and the situation of democracies in the last 15, 18 years have been quite negative. There are more countries that become anti-democratic. So the earlier optimism, and when we thought until 2015, 2005, when started in Hungary and in other places to move from democracy to dictatorship or to at least authoritarian, this doesn't bode well. But on the other hand, there is enough support for that studying the history can make it possible to claim. If we don't know who we are and who we were and what kind of demands we have, this is exactly difficult for people to demand anything. For instance, I'm trying to think of an example. There is the need to redress, and there are different types of redress, from culture, from narrative, and how to include and integrate indigenous peoples in the national narrative. National not because it's one group, but because it has different groups that are all under sovereignty, in which especially places like Guam, as the not strong organizations, it's very difficult to include it. If anybody wants to have more readings of historical dialogue, and remember please, when I said the word dialogue, it's not necessarily one talking to each other, two sides talking to each other, but it's elaborating of the position that the indigenous peoples hold. Because the indigenous people, just like any other groups, don't know their history. And what does it go with indigenous? It's very difficult. And also, there is another problem in indigenous understanding of history, is how to elaborate and to come to an agreement between individual indigenous people, individual rights, and the group right. And what happened when there is a collision? That happened a lot in the US, where a lot of indigenous cases where people wanted to utilize the knowledge they have of indigenous Native American life. They wanted to use that to sell it through workshops, through sweat lodges. They wanted to benefit individually from that. And so who decides who can use the indigenous identity and narrative and who cannot use it? This is a lot of work that has to be done within the indigenous communities. And it's a difficult road. I don't for a moment suggest that you can do ABC and solve the problem, but I think that you can very much involve the narrative and pay attention to it, because this is not wasting time about the importance of narratives, the importance of knowledge and demand and making strong claims are very important for any activities in the future. Okay, I think that we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you very much for your attendance. I'll be happy to answer questions and to let you and give you more information. If you can collect the information and send me an email, I will be very happy to provide you with more reading material. But the important thing is to look at the long term. And nobody does that better than indigenous people.
Thank you so much, Professor Barkan. That was a very, very enlightening first session. Just to close, redress is never a direct path. Like Whitney mentioned earlier, that is, we're confronted, even as we're fighting for justice, we're confronted with other challenges and other various retaliation from the state. So redress and dialogues are never always a direct action. We'll always be confronted with these kind of challenges. But I want to close with what Professor Barkan had said earlier, that Indigenous people need to describe their own history, and we need to legitimize our own suffering and always speak about it. Storytelling plays a very important role here as well, so that we will never forget the parts that our ancestors walked, the sufferings that we had suffered in the past. And I think it's only when we speak and keep talking about it that we will never forget, and that will inform our fight for justice in the future and as we go along. Thank you so much, Professor Barkan. For FIMI, we have a certificate of appreciation for you. If Javier can just put it up on the screen for Professor Barkan.
Thank you. And just remember always, justice comes in different ways.
Thank you, Professor Barkan.
We missed the course. I hope you'll enjoy and learn a lot from Elsa and the other visitors.
Thank you so much, Professor.
You're welcome.
And we wish you good health and success always, Professor. And we hope to meet you one day. We missed the offline sessions with Columbia University again this year, but we really appreciate that you've made the time to be with us virtually and for sharing. So thank you so much, Professor, and we wish you good health, love, and happiness always from all of us here at FIMI.
I very much appreciate it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And good success.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you, Professor Elsa. It's nice to see you, as well as Christina as well. I can see her on the screen. So thank you, Christina, for joining us as well. We will now move on to the next session. Our next guest, Tanya. Tanya is here. I would like to hand over the second part of the session to Sister Orte to take this forward. Before that, I would just like to introduce Tanya. Tanya, thank you so much for being with us in spite of this short notice. We welcome you, and so just to introduce Tanya, Tanya is a Quechua indigenous leader and a human rights activist, and she is a former Congresswoman of the Republic of Peru from the year 2016 to 2019. She has a bachelor's in social work and a master's in human development. She also has training in indigenous rights and the mechanisms of the United Nations system, and is also an active member of the Continental Women of Women and associate of the Center for Cultures in Peru. And she continues to have a high level of commitment to working with indigenous community, women and young people in Peru and at the international level. Welcome, Sister Tanya. She will be talking to us on the developments of statements in the United Nations Permanent Forum, as well as the registration of new organizations. So welcome, Sister Tanya, and over to you, Sister Orte, to take this forward.
Muy buenos días, queridas hermanas. Gracias, Joy. Muchas gracias a todas las
Good morning,
hermanas
sisters.
que,
Thank you so much.
que a
Welcome,
través de
all
esta
sisters who
plataforma
have been here today in this platform. And thanks for the invitation from FEMI to this 10th Leadership School. I think it's a great opportunity for every woman to exercise their empowerment, their rights, to continue with our fights from the collective thinking and building new paths for the new generations as well. Could you help me with the presentation, or should I project the PowerPoint?
Yes. Javier will share it from our end. Brother Javier, if you're there, can you please project that? Yes, okay.
Bien. Ok, entonces, sí, pasamos al siguiente slide.
Yeah, let's move to the next slide.
Bien, entonces aquí tenemos una foto, ¿verdad? Del foro permanente.
Here's a picture, an image of the permanent forum. We all know that the 22nd session this year is going to happen from the 17th to 28th of April. I'm sure that you've already had information about this. Next one. As Joy said, I would like to talk to you from my experience within Indigenous women's movement, how we have suffered, how we have worked in being able to have better strategies for the permanent forum. I would say that everything else from our participation has to do with being registered at the permanent forum. According to their guidelines, it talks about a pre-registration and a registration to the permanent forum in 3 categories of participation of participants. The first time is in the category of the Organization of Indigenous Peoples, like the ones that we come from. It could be networks, collectives, groups. They could be local, national, international partnerships, but that are related to our ways of organization, of articulation. We also have the second category, which defines the permanent forum, and that is for non-governmental organizations with consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council. They are NGOs, they're known as such, but they are recognized by ECOSOC to participate in some sessions that require this recognition. this consultative status, so they can present reports, they can be present, because not all of the sessions organized by the commissions are open. In this case, non-governmental organizations that have this consultative recognition by ECOSOC do have authorization for this, so they can participate in the permanent forum. Third, we have academic institutions, such as universities, research departments, ethnic studies areas, or indigenous people studies, or related to the permanent forum work. How important is it to be registered? As I said, is the first step before we talk about the forum, how it works and things like that. I think we need to state our existence as an NGO or an academic institution or indigenous people. So it's important to be in the database by the permanent forum. The permanent forum has been building over the years and a wide and large database of all the organizations that have participated by sessions. This helps show how many organizations have participated, who has participated, and to also have a voice as women in this case, as a people, as communities, as collectives, as groups. We also can highlight that it allows us show or give visibility to our struggle, to our work. If we're registered in an organization such as the Permanent Forum, that will also give us access to information and to be visible in this database, as I said. What I think is most important is that when you are able to register to participate in the Permanent Forum, that opens possibilities to establish network contacts with different actors. It could be representatives from the government, UN bodies, other non-governmental bodies. It includes international cooperation, networks, indigenous networks, indigenous groups. And that is wonderful, because once you're in the permanent forum, you can link with women from the Arctic, from Asia, from Africa. And I think the indigenous women's movement at a global level has been nourishing from these relationships. From all of these networks that participate in the permanent forum, the process has demonstrated that it is possible to have a collective voice. And just as we represent our organization, by weaving connections with other networks, we're not going to be by ourselves. We can work in coalition. We can work together on specific themes, because you work with another, you're connected with another group that has the same objectives as you do. So you don't work by yourself in a space that is so big, so wide, where at least 1,200 people participate in each session period, according to the statistics by the Permanent Forum Secretariat. Being registered allows you to participate in the events inside and outside of the UN, which happens, of course, within the framework of the Permanent Forum. You can also advocate in different areas. For example, if you're registered, you participate in the Permanent Forum, and you have the ID that allows you to get into the rooms.
Especiales de las Naciones Unidas.
You can also talk to or contact the relator, the repertoire, the specific repertoires. We talked once with the one that was in charge of environment, and we talked to the special repertoire about our environmental issues and the health that is being affected by people because they drank contaminated water, because the fish don't have the same water and the water has been deteriorated little by little. One can have access to a variety of spaces and actors with whom to interact and to and you can write down contact and other information. Also, if you're registered as Indigenous peoples, I think that that is very important, and it has to do with the existence of our own organizational processes. Another important subject, there are brothers and sisters, Indigenous brothers and sisters, who also have representation within the government. And if you participate as government representative or from some legislative power or legislative branch, you can participate in the final sessions of the permanent forum, participate in the events that are close to the public, more or less, but open to the government. So we can also have participation there as authorities, elected authorities, but also as Indigenous people.
And it really depends what the policy is or the area that we're representing when we serve as politicians or authorities, rather, and Indigenous peoples. I was in the government in 2017, and I was able to participate as a representative of the government, well, rather, of the legislative branch. And I was always I was also able to hold dialogue spaces with other entities in the government and talk about the situation of Indigenous people and Indigenous women and focus on these topics of consultation in order to grant different resources to extractive companies and how the rights weren't being respected as they should. So I was able to participate with the Indigenous people and with an NGO as a consultant. And this is extremely helpful in order to have a organic, collective, and visible presence. And I would encourage you all, sisters, to also be able to do this if that's the case. You can make the most of the permanent forum and you can work on different topics in order to be prepared when you're at the permanent forum and not just explore there. You can research and have established knowledge on how the permanent forum works in order to access these spaces. And we have sisters that started working about 20 or 15 years ago on this, and they didn't know how this entity worked, and they just learned about it when they arrived at the United Nations. In fact, I also learned on the go, but we truly want new generations to arrive with previous knowledge and to be prepared and make the most of the days and the hours that they spend there. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Here, this is a screenshot from the permanent forum page, and this is the process for registration. I won't explain the registration process step by step. And thank you. I'll speak a little slower so that the interpretation can take place. So as I was saying, on this screen, we see a screenshot from the permanent forum page. This is a link to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And here you can see how you have to register the organization. First, you have to create an account on Indico. And here we see the link to this platform to Indico in order to fill out the information for the organization. You can go online and you can write registration for new organizations to the Permanent UN Forum, and here you'll see the steps. These are the steps that the Permanent Forum explains, and this is a screenshot again. We won't go step by step. In fact, I'd like to invite you to explore this process during your free time, and obviously do this before you think of going to the Permanent Forum and registering. Now, I'd also like to mention the following. If you've signed up as an Indigenous organization, or as one of the categories that are indicated, you're going to receive a formal, official invitation from the Permanent Forum, and that will help you with your visa. That'll allow you to go to the consulate or embassy of the United States in your country and obtain your visa, which isn't always an easy process. And this way, your participation in the UN Permanent Forum will be guaranteed, and you'll be able to travel to New York, which is the headquarters of the United Nations. Let's go on to the next slide. Sisters, I would now like to discuss this next topic with you, which is the statements. What is a statement? How do you develop it? And how do you present it? These are key points for our process. So first, what is a statement? A statement is a position document on political and social topics. I think that's the best definition for a statement. This document has a very important value for your advocacy in the forum, where there will also be representatives from different governments. And it expresses all of our proposals, demands, our voices, our positions, and everything that we hope will be considered. Generally, the statements are read in the plenary session, and these are collective statements as women organizations, youth organizations, representatives of peoples, or representatives of a thematic group.
Haya escuchado una lectura de una declaración
It's
personal.
very rare that I've heard a personal statement be read. For example, my declaration as Tania Pariona. It's very rare for that to take place. And throughout the years, the Permanent Forum has been prioritizing the collective statements, statements that represent a lot of people with a position that has been consented to by the group in a genuine manner. So I'd say that it carries greater weight if the statement is collective and not personal. It won't be rejected if it's personal, but it'll have greater impact if we do it in the name of women that have undersigned or the names of our peoples or certain networks. As I've mentioned, this statement will contain our proposals, our demands, the violations of human rights that perhaps have been taking place in our country, information on living conditions, health, and territory. Perhaps we want certain changes to be made in order to grant a greater level of citizenship to Indigenous peoples. Every year, the topic changes and is very specific. So the statements must be specific to that topic. If not, the statement won't truly be considered. That is to say, that the statement is considered important if it is cohesive and reflects the topic of the session. I've noticed at the forum that we are carrying with us all of the problems that our peoples face. Human rights violations, loss of territory, violations carried out against women. There are many problems. but this session is dedicated to one specific topic. For example, intercultural and bilingual education and indigenous languages. And if we don't address that topic, then our statement may be ignored. We can perhaps give our statement, but it won't truly be considered. So we recommend that this statement focus on the specific topic of the forum. There's a main topic and then there are some subtopics, and you should focus on those topics. Now, how to present the statement. This is very important as well, and maybe some of you know this and have knowledge on this topic, but generally, you're only given 3 minutes to present your statement. So in 3 minutes maximum, you have to read this statement, which shouldn't be longer than a page and a half, because that's your opportunity. And your statement has to be specific, it has to be concrete without giving too much context. You have to dive into the topic and include the recommendations and the proposals that we would like to be considered as part of the recommendations that the UN Permanent Forum will make for the member states. Next slide, please. Now, I don't know if you can see the letters, the words here rather, but this is a screenshot from the proclamation of the ECMIA, which includes at least 23 countries. This is a collective statement here. So for example, we look at the third topic here. This statement is focused on topic 3 of the 14th session of the Permanent Forum in 2015, several years ago now. And the topic is to do follow-up to the Permanent Forum's recommendations. And here in the bold fonts, we see that the agenda was based on the follow-up to the Conference of Indigenous Peoples in 2014. And in that moment, we were talking about the agenda post 2015 and the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. So the topics here, the statement is based on that. So we see that the sisters of the ECMIA have focused on 6 recommendations. We're able to see them 1, 2, 3, and they all are based on topic 3. Let's look at recommendation 1. Through the permanent forum, we recommend that states commit to respecting and effectively implementing the agreements of the resolution approved in the conference. So here, that's a reference to the World Conference, to the empowerment of women, youth, and children, Indigenous women, youth, and children, and their political participation, as well as the elimination of all forms of violence. I've read the whole paragraph because in a declaration, we need to use strategic language. It doesn't necessarily have to be legal in nature, but it needs to be clear, coherent, and follow the topic of the forum. This isn't necessarily a statement to accuse or blame or disqualify anyone, although we may feel like that because we may feel that the states aren't truly fulfilling their promises. Maybe we've heard the representative from certain country say that their country is doing a fantastic job and that Indigenous peoples have a lot of protections with guaranteed human rights. And we see the reality and we could say that is not true. You could be upset and want to express yourself in the permanent forum. But if we're going to give a statement, we cannot include all of that feeling that we have in it because it'll take seconds to express yourself. So the question is twofold. Do you want to effectively advocate on the recommendations of the permanent forum, or do you want to make a public and energetic complaint where you'll just be heard and it's most probable that no recommendation will truly take place? So, in order for us to not fall into one of these extremes, we want to find the middle point. And according to my experience, it's the following. We want to be smart when it comes to our use of language. In the first line, we can make a reference to this feeling of being upset as to what's going on, and then we need to talk about the topic and what we want to propose.
The forum is a space to have constructive recommendations. That was difficult for me to understand initially because according to my logic, the permanent forum should be the space where one presents all the problems and the indigenous people's voice, all of the complaints, but it has its limitations. So you should choose a strategic path that is best to take advantage of that space to be able to gain recognition and rights, to be more explicit in terms of Indigenous women's rights. Throughout the years, our older sisters have very strategic, I believe, very committed, and they have obtained great achievements, great advancement in terms of the rights of Indigenous women. So that statement is really important. It's the document that will remain. You're going to be there, you're going to spend there 3, 5, 7 days, you leave. But what remains is your statement, the written piece that should get to the hands of the members of the permanent forum. So it needs to get to them as an official recommendation from the permanent forum to the states. So it's like the most important product that you need to leave behind in writing at the forum. As we say, and this phrase is very common, that that is not written down doesn't exist. So if we do not leave a good written statement with substantial content and then we go back home, it's most likely that everything we have said remained just in the air, in the conversation, which is important, but is not written down. And to draft the final permanent forum documentation, the members go back to the statements, to the recommendations given to them. So they make, let's say, a detailed selection of what is most important, the newest issues or the most current issues. So that's how that statement can be can remain for long term. Is going to feed the indigenous movement and their request for the rights. So there's a lot of criteria that play a role for our document to be effective. Part of another recommendation that I should give you is that the document doesn't advance by itself. You leave the document and then doesn't suddenly become a recommendation. No. Once you present the statement or before you do, we need to talk to the government and foreign representatives to highlight some of the recommendations that are of the most interest to us. So we should tell them, Mr. Representative, brother from your country, perhaps, we are presenting a recommendation in reference to women and children or girls who are today suffering violence in different ways, sexual, psychological, etc. So you talk about this topic, then you give, you turn in the statement as well, you give them the statement. So you are advocating for this person to also commit to working towards that goal. So you want him to be able to say, or her to be able to say, this person talked to me about this issue, so I'm going to commit to doing something about it. And they're the ones who have the last word for the final product. So for the final permanent forum product, that contains the recommendations. The main competency of the permanent forum is to issue recommendations to the states. So let's move on to the last slide. So the question is, what is an efficient statement? So I already mentioned these points, but one thing is to know the special topic and subtopics of the session. For example, for this year, they're going to talk about indigenous peoples, human health, planet health, territorial health, and climate change, a focus based on the rights. That is the main topic. If we want to make a statement, it needs to focus on this topic. So we need to have clear the primary recommendations that we want to achieve. It's not a good idea to make 20 recommendations.
Primero, porque no da tiempo
Not
de
to make a long list. First of all, because there's not enough time in 3 minutes to read it all. And secondly, because out of those 10 or 20, only 3 are really relevant. You know which ones are. So prioritize the most important ones. It's not about quantity, but quality. Highlight what's most important. Then be specific using strategic language. And I think that indigenous peoples are very capable of doing that, and to accompany our language with the performance of our own, maybe a short song or our indigenous word, something like that. So it could be very impactful, historically impactful, to be in a space like that, leaving a precedent of our existence as indigenous peoples. Then give copies of your presentation to the interpreters, which I should have done today, giving a lot of information so that there's plenty of time to be reviewed and translated. This is very important because your documents need to be translated at least into English. Not everyone speaks Spanish or English. So it is very important to have it always in Spanish, English, perhaps English, French. So it depends on who you want to reach, but it is very good to have it translated at least into English, which is the language that connects us to other countries where they don't speak Spanish. Talk to the members of the permanent forum to make sure your recommendation is taken into account. There are 16 members. You only need to find 2 or 3 to talk to them, the ones that you find more accessible, that you know about. Those we know will advocate for us. You can also add networks and organizations to your statement that provide support to your statement. So it's not the same if I come with a statement that comes from the Quechua people of Peru, the Quechua women, from my most regional group. But if that organization also comes with support from Quechuas from Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, it's more powerful. It means that your document has larger support. That's why FIMI presents their statements with the indigenous women's networks, because they're together. FIMI is like the big umbrella, and it carries a lot of weight. The important thing is that the voices, the issues that affect Indigenous women from all over the world are in that document. Finally, there's got to be follow-up to that report that the Permanent Forum makes with the recommendations. There are not going to be 40 recommendations, as I said, perhaps fewer, the most important ones. And we have to check whether our recommendations were selected or whether there's any mention at least of them. And then keep an eye on the compliance by the governments. I think that that is the work that we need to do as women leaders, activists, committed to women's rights and Indigenous people's rights. A statement is only an advocacy tool, but the work after that is to follow up, to continue advocating with the authorities so that it is applied, so that it's effective. So that's the biggest challenge, but as we've said in this session, the statement per se is the product that you need to leave behind. You have to make sure that it's taken into account at the Permanent Forum. Joe, I believe that this is my last slide. So what I would like to add so that my sisters here know, and to conclude, the year 2010, the Indigenous Women's Networks were able to have the Permanent Forum recommend within these official recommendations the need to have a worldwide mechanism that will kind of watch, and it was from Indigenous women dedicated to collect information on the violation that women and girls, Indigenous women and girls suffer, so to make them more visible and to have activities to promote measures to eradicate this violence. This was directed to UN bodies such as UNICEF, UN Women. This was an achievement by Indigenous women at the world level, and we're making this more specific through FIMI. So there is an effect. It does have, there's a path there that can generate better mechanisms to be able to exercise our rights, to watch the different scenarios where women and girls' rights are violated, and to have this supported by other frameworks, political frameworks at the international level. So that advocacy came from work by Indigenous women who put a lot of work and effort into it. Thank you, Joy. I apologize to the interpreters because I spoke quite fast, and that's difficult to follow. I apologize for that. If there are any questions, I would be pleased to answer. Thank you so much, Sister Tania, for such an interesting presentation. We know that is the voice of experience. It's the voice that comes with a lot of participation that you've already had. It's a young life, but a long trajectory, and we value that a lot. We respect you a lot, and thank you for sharing that experience, that knowledge with the participants here today. And now we're going to invite also the women leaders participating in this 10th edition of the school, Indigenous Women's Global Leadership School, to ask questions if they would like. We know that they are preparing themselves to advocate during the Permanent Forum, Indigenous Peoples Permanent Forum. So Joneri has her hand raised, so you can go ahead and start. We're going to have 3 or 4 questions in a row, And then we'll have Sister Tanya answer. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, sisters. I wanted to ask whether to register for the UN Permanent Forum, for example, as women leaders or as part of a collective or a group, and now part of FEMI, do we need to pay when we register? That's my question. Thank you. Thank you, Janeri. Another question? Any other question? We invite you to ask, since we have someone who can clarify all of our questions.
While you're working on asking your questions, we would like to inform you that each region will have the responsibility of writing their own statements. So let's make the most of today and ask our questions and clarify any doubts we may have. Sister Tanya, while the participants get ready to ask their questions, maybe we can answer Doneli's question. Of course, thank you so much to our sister for her question. You don't pay not even $1 for the registration. This is a virtual process. You have to fill out a form with information on the organization. For example, when the organization was created, how many members it has, if it's registered legally, what the objectives are. So you just put in the information for the organization, but they won't ask you for any money for that. This is just an administrative virtual process. It is not difficult, but you do need to have patience because you need to follow a few steps and you need to have some documentation at hand. That's all. So that's the answer. Thank you. Thank you. Now, let's give Anima the floor, please. Thank you.
Anima su micrófono.
Anima, your microphone? We are not able to hear you right now. We can't hear you, Anima.
Hello? Hello?
Ya, ahora la escuchamos.
We can hear you now.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I just wanted to clarify if the registration is required for those who would be present physically, for the forum, or is it is it the registration is required for everyone who's participating?
Gracias, Anima. También
Thank
Joy
you,
tiene la
Anima.
mano levantada.
Joy has also raised her hand, so you can go ahead.
Thank you, Sister Orte, and thank you, Sister Tanya, for that presentation. Before, I would just like to clarify a few things before we go ahead and have our questions. I think we are aware that we will not be going to the permanent forum physically, right, this year because of earlier issue with our visas. And I have very sad news to also share that this year the permanent forum will only happen physically, online. So in the offline, sorry. So in the previous years, what happened was, they had a mixed mode where people could go last year as well. People could go there and deliver their statements, but also there were the participants, the organizations could also participate online. But this year, if you look at the website that I had shared earlier in the chat of the permanent forum, you will notice that it is completely online. However, completely offline. I'm so sorry, completely offline. So there may not be any option for us to also participate online, but we will be practicing. We will be practicing the development of statements because we will send the statement to the permanent forum. So FIMI has decided that there will be a representative from FIMI who will be in New York at that point of time. So that particular person will read the statement of the global school on behalf of all the participants. It's really really sad that we cannot be there, but I think this is the only solution right now where we can give our statement in the permanent forum. So I just want to clarify that. And usually the last 2 years there's also been
Gracias, Joy, y gracias.
site events site events wherein we could participate online, but I just want to clarify again that the site events list has not been out yet by the permanent forum. So more information on the kind of site events that will happen and if we can participate online. They've mentioned in the website that this information will be available in March, so we will keep you updated. But we may not have to register our organizations for this year, but it's good to know because we will be, our advocacy work will continue over the years, and we need to be equipped with that kind of knowledge for our organizations, especially if we're new to the system. So Tanya's presentation is really, really important for us to understand, to know, because we may not have this kind of a session ever again. So just for our knowledge, it's important to understand the Indico process. So just to clarify, we may not have to register because we will not be attending offline, and there is no option to attend online as well. But let's take this opportunity to understand the process, so that in the years to come, if we participate next year, we would already be aware and we would already know how to register our organizations and develop our statements. So yes, I would just like to clarify that. So thank you, Tanya and Sister Orpe. Over to you.
Gracias, Joy.
Thank you, Joy.
Son cambios que se están dando.
These are changes that are taking place, and sadly, it's out of our hands. But the training and this process is for all of you to also become consultants in your organizations. What we want is for the reality in the community to be amplified at this level. And how can we participate? Well, our sister Joy has told us that we will carry out the exercise of writing our statements, and in this manner, we'll be channeling this information through an ally. We will have a representative of FIMI. We will have a voice at that level. That person will be responsible of sharing our statements. With all of the information that we're receiving, we would like you to learn about this whole process, and then you can share this knowledge in your own organizations and in your own networks. You'll be able to advise others, open the path, and help this reality that we live be elevated to these spaces. Lucia has raised her hand. You have the floor. Thank you so much, sister. Good morning, everyone. I will turn my video off because my internet is a bit unstable. Thank you, Sister Tanya, for what you shared with us. We've heard the recommendations, and before making our collective recommendations as part of this school, it's important to think about what's been said previously, because we could repeat what's been said before, years ago, and it'll just be repetitive and repetitive, and it might not be as effective since those recommendations may not be considered. First, I think we should review what's been said and develop new proposals because there are so many topics to be addressed. We have all of these legal frameworks that have been recognized in different countries, but that don't recognize or truly guarantee the rights. We see all of these topics that impact our rights, and we see how other events also impact these standards in our countries and prevent them from being fulfilled. One of the recommendations is to review everything that's already been shared in the past so that we don't repeat these recommendations again. Thank you.
Gracias, Lucía.
Thank you, Lucia.
Definitivamente, en el transcurso de estas semanas vamos a recibir
During the following weeks, we'll have
información
a variety of guests, and we'll also be able to get information on how to see the recommendations that have already been made. That's very important. And Sister Tanya, maybe you're able to speak a little on the need to review what's been done already and how is it that we can strengthen these recommendations. Thank you. Yes, this is very relevant. The contributions made by our sisters Joy and Lucia are very relevant. It is true that recommendations could have been made on these topics before. Ideally, we don't want to repeat them. We want to share something new and different. That's always best. You have to go into the Permanent Forum website, and there you can see all of the recommendations that have been made until now. I think there's more than 2,000 recommendations. When speaking to other sisters, other leaders, we always say that there needs to be an exhaustive categorization of the recommendations on the basis of the topics, and then we're able to maybe do a follow-up with concrete indicators. It is true that in this forum, there have been many recommendations made to the member states. How many are truly followed up on? Well, that's when we would have to analyze that. There's a few that are not implemented, that are not spoken about, that also happens. But what Lucia said is really important. It is important to review the recommendations that have already been made on this specific topic. These could be recommendations from the Permanent Forum, and we can also look at studies on this topic made by the Indigenous peoples experts. This is another mechanism that exists in Geneva, and they've been able to develop thematic studies. So if a study exists on this topic and they've also issued recommendations, that's excellent. We can look at them, we can look at the existing framework and ensure that our recommendation will be strong and not just a wish that we have. We want it to be cohesive, and if we can base it on previous documentation, that would be wonderful. When it comes to the statements, I think that the exercise that you'll be doing here in the school is fantastic. You have to do this exercise. You can assign different roles. One sister can review existing recommendations. A second sister can look for studies and research on the recommendations of the experts. And you can research this so that then in the forum, the sister in charge, our representative, whoever is there will be able to read it in the name of this program in our school. That would be fantastic. That is a very valuable proposal of, of having that statement read, even if we're physically not there. That would be the best.
Thank you, Sister Tanya. Any other questions? Any comments? Any experience to share? It is also important to also remember, as Tanya mentioned, that the voice should be collective. That is very important in partnerships. Sometimes protagonism can be something that takes over, and we have to remember that they only give us a few minutes to make our statements. So what do participants say? Let's see. We want to see the leaderships that you, have in you. We'd like to see your comments, your questions. What do our women leaders say? Everything is clear? Any questions? Anything you'd like to share? From Mexico, our sisters from Mexico are kind of quiet today. Medalith, your hand is raised. I give you the floor. Yes, good morning and good afternoon. My question has to do with the proclamations that are made, that will be made. Are we going to do them by regions? We come from the Latin American region. How is that going to be done? Will it be through meetings outside of the class time? How will we be doing that? Right now, for example, we have this issue of whether we can meet or not. It's difficult. We all have different schedules. Sometimes some don't say when we can meet. We have jobs outside of this schedule. How will that be done? Thank you, Medalith. Each region has a specific advisor, so each one will decide on the methodology. In our case, Latin America, like in other years, we have had meetings by region, and we have had them virtually. It has been a good experience because it gives us the opportunity to get to know a little bit more about the realities and issues from our countries. So we're going to do that in terms of the Latin American region. We'll do that at a regional level, and then we'll present our proclamation to our statement to PIMI, and we will consolidate then the results, all of the results from each region. But yes, there will be an exercise of this nature by region. Anyone else, please? We're offering you to take this opportunity, take a few minutes to have your voice heard and share with us. Any other questions, or all of the information is clear? Lucia, please go ahead. Yes, thank you. So after presenting recommendations, what happens after that? How do we carry out that monitoring of the recommendations by region? So all of the recommendations were presented at this permanent forum. How do we follow up on that? Yes, I can answer the question made by Lucia. I believe that there are several mechanisms to follow up on the recommendations from the forum. If we're in our countries, at a national level, we have the government with its own structure, with the executive, legislative, judicial branches. They can, of course, implement some of those recommendations. I believe that we need to take the initiative. Which one of all of those recommendations do we believe that is a priority for our country or for Indigenous women, for example, in Peru, in my case? So take one or two and start requesting reports to also disseminate the recommendation. In some countries, people don't know or ignore them. So we can take the recommendation to build a public response proposal or to formulate a bill, an initiative for a law, for example, on violence. In Peru, this is an example. After the armed conflict that we had in Peru after that time, under law, or by the law, the right to redress was recognized for the women who suffered sexual rape in the context of the war. So it only talked about rape, but in the war context, women suffered not only rape, they also suffered torture, they suffered abortions that were provoked, they suffered torture in their genitals, they were violated, things that are all under sexual violence, which is different from rape. But the law didn't cover all of those women. However, there were at least 5,000 women who have not been sexually violated but suffered aggression in their condition of women as women. If we have a recommendation that speaks to the different forms of violence against women, and we also have an instrument such as the International Convention Against All Forms of Violence, you take that instrument, that document, and formulate the law to say that that law is being limited because it only recognizes cases of rape, but there are other cases of sexual violence. So you can use that as an argument to present something like that. So you can propose within sexual violence, which is now recognized in the legal framework, not only international, but also national, you can start making cases visible. In Peru, for example, forced sterilizations that were done on women, especially indigenous women, perpetrated by the government of the 90s. So you take a topic, you develop it, you write the proposal, you propose. As indigenous women, I believe that we have to do that work after the fact. choosing one or two recommendations, a specific topic, until the end, until there's an achievement. I believe it's possible. Many of the recommendations by the Permanent Forum nowadays are known because of the work by Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women. The same happens with discrimination. Write the reports, present them to the body, the pertinent body, to make the situation visible or to propose a public policy that is more intercultural. But just the topic of violence against women is so large, so wide, that a lot of work is needed in our countries. The technical specificity, the linguistic specificity, and the variety of the violations, that's all not taken into account. We talk about only 5 types of violence that women suffer: psychological, economic, physical, sexual, financial, I meant, and feminicide. They don't talk about institutional violence, environmental violence suffered by women, discrimination as a form of violence in some cases. So it opens up a great area to continue advocating. So one topic, one issue can generate other issues. So that's one mechanism. The other one is to continue following up with the institutions, such as, okay, dear institution, this recommendation has been made. What is the Ministry of Women doing? What is the environmental ministry doing? Ask for answers, develop public events so that we can make those recommendations visible, the recommendations from the document, because that won't happen unless there's an act or someone who advocates for that visibility. In my experience, in the political arena, which is different in each country, I, for example, talked to politicians who didn't even know about these recommendations. They didn't even want to believe that they exist. They said, yes, they do exist. Yes, this declaration exists. Convention 190 exists, and this is the point about this, and that's the point about that. It exists. So if you have this knowledge, you win. You win the argument. So our role is crucial, and I know that in this room there are sisters who are women leaders, professionals, activists, some lawyers, some work with an entity or do political advocacy, political lobbying. That's what we need to do. The school here, what it does is to give you tools to drive and foster actions that respond to this current context, because the context keeps changing. So that's just a comment that pertains to all of us, because that is what we do. That's what I do in Peru with networks. That's my role as an Indigenous woman, and we have a lot of challenges. I believe that the school is a starting point that is very, very valuable. I know that from here we will see very important actions will be generated. Make that visible too. It's a process that is taking time. It has implied learning a lot of knowledge, and it shows the challenge also in terms of decisions by the government. Thank you, Sister Tania. Absolutely. We have to recognize that the progress has been made. However, there are a lot of topics that are stuck, and in some countries we've even gone backwards. And I believe that it's important, as she said, to follow up about all the responsibilities by the institutions. Sometimes we get to that point where we find out that there are in our countries responsible parties who should be following up on those recommendations. And as she said, we need to prepare ourselves with information, with knowledge. We need to continue reading It's a constant effort, constant reading and learning. And sometimes we don't do that. We don't read enough, we don't inform ourselves enough before getting to those spaces. For that, we are, to that end, we're sharing all of this information. That's why we have professors, teachers, experts that come to share their experience, their leadership. That in itself is a progress for us. It's advancement for us to have a young woman such as Tania with so much knowledge. I learned all the UN nation systems, such as the Permanent Forum for the Indigenous issues. I learned that later. Each way, I keep learning through this process. And when organizations need our experience, need us to help, we're there with that knowledge to share it. Because our brothers and sisters in our communities don't have the opportunity we have by being here right now. That is very valuable, that is extremely important. Perhaps we cannot be in person, but the information, we're receiving it from experienced voices that I value a lot. It isn't the same to read a document or to hear Tania's voice explaining to us what the statement is and that it is an advocacy tool. I continue to invite you as well. If you have any other questions or comments, let's take this opportunity.
We have about 8 minutes left, so let's make the most of these last minutes that we have with our sister Tania. Yes, while we're waiting for our sisters to ask questions, I don't want to dizzy you with so much information, but we've learned from experience and all of the learnings and mistakes. I think many of us are now able to participate in these processes. Before, we didn't have the leadership school. Now we have this opportunity, which is so valuable. What I learned is that you need to go to the forum prepared. You need to have your document ready. Maybe there can be changes as you listen to other speeches and other topics that are being addressed, but it is not possible to prepare it there. We've done that in the past. We've held late evenings reviewing our statements. But if you do the job beforehand, like we have the opportunity to do now, it'll be even more satisfying. You'll know how it works, you know the impact it can have. You can ensure that that document will reach the hands of the decision makers and not get lost in the process. Sometimes sisters get put down in the list of speakers, give their statements in, but then it gets lost around along the way. We need to have it in the archive. The statement isn't for us, the statement is for the authorities. So it's always better when we do this beforehand with preparation. We've learned this, and we used to have preparatory meetings for the forum with 10, 15 people from different countries, and that's where we would draft our statements. It's true that we all want to include our priorities. When a statement is regional, there are so many needs. Colombia wants a topic, Chile another. Every single country wants to include a topic. But we need to find a consensus, or we need to ensure that that paragraph will represent everyone. That is also a challenge in itself. We need to understand that the statement must be inclusive. That is extremely important. We can't let someone feel left out of it. And then once you're prepared, you start working on your agenda. If you're there for 5 days and you're thinking it'll just be 5 days of listening, that won't make sense. It'll be 5 days, but you'll also be meeting with the special rapporteur. You'll be contacting people from the network. You'll be following up with a topic that is important for you. And you can, for example, talk to the media about what's going on in your country. There are always going to be representatives from alternative media in the forum. If you want to be on the UN TV, then you can contact someone, we can get an interview. So, really, this is for you to make the most of it. This is key. And we learned all of that at the forum, and we used to do it. We used to give an interview. Our voices were heard. How many sisters would like to be in a space like that but are not able to do so? When you have the opportunity, you have to make the most of it because this will be heard around the world. It isn't the parliament of your country, it's an international forum. After a few years, I understood the importance of that space. It can have so much importance if you truly understand the strategic importance and use. There are a lot of interesting events. You're able to build sisterhoods with other representatives. I was, for example, able to participate in the youth caucus, and it was fantastic. There was such a strong presence. I think that at the beginning there were very few young people there, men and women participating in the forum. And then afterwards, more young people from around the world met, and they used to meet 2 days before the forum in order to write these statements for the youth caucus. So we have to be prepared. We can't just go there to experiment. And I think that the Indigenous movement has learned that on the way. So we're able to achieve steps, and it's little by little that we've managed to have an international presence. I was able to hear the professor that spoke before my presentation, and there's a lot of learning, a lot of knowledge that can be shared. And we've been able to do this there, even when it comes to discussions in the academic space. It's very sad that you can't be in the forum in person. I would recommend that you map the agenda of parallel events. I'm sure many of them will be hybrid. FIMI will have some hybrid events, and you need to participate in all the FIMI events that you can. During the permanent forum, we'll have a program. I can share a little on this, but we will be launching the Global Observatory of Indigenous Women Against Violence. The official launch will be during the forum, and we want you to know about this. We want women from around the world to know about this. So the event will be hybrid. We will have participants there in person and online. This is an open invitation to you all. Joy will be sharing more information, but follow everything that you can. It's possible to be there virtually as well. So, on the next opportunity, you'll already be prepared. You'll have all the tools. And, well, there are also opportunities to participate as in a voluntary manner in this permanent forum. And the voluntary fund would be able to provide some financing. That's a different topic altogether, but we can look into that so that more women, new leaders are also able to participate. Thank you so much. Sending you all lots of love and a lot of success in this training. Thank you so much, Sister Tanya. The truth is that whenever I hear you, I am also learning so much from you. And I really admire your experience when you came to Guatemala. I was able to hear you, and thank you so much for sharing with us. Thank you for giving us your time, your appreciation, and your care as well. If that weren't the case, you wouldn't be here today. Thank you so much. We wish you all the best in your life and, well, a lifetime of happiness. That's most important, and I hope you have it. So we will be here happy what we learn, a lot of times we fight, and instead of opening doors, that closes doors. So thank you so much, Sister Tanya. And I would like to continue to invite the participants to put their shyness to the side and to comment, question, and raise their voices. That is why we have this space. And today we've concluded 2 weeks in this process. I still feel a little bit of that shyness. It's a bit difficult to turn the microphones on. I know some names, but that's because they're the only ones that speak. So right now, we're finishing up the session, but before leaving, I'd like to give Sister Joy some time so that she can conclude this session and share any information that she would like to share with the group. It's been a pleasure to share this session with you, and I wish you all a lovely weekend and a lot of energy and happiness. Thank you, sisters.
Thank you so much, Sister Orte, and thank you, Sister Tanya, for being here. We hope we will be meeting you in physically as well in the months to come. Hopefully, that will happen for all of us. So before we close today's session, sisters, I would just like to press on what Professor Barkan was saying earlier. So he mentioned, that if you have any questions, or you would want, to connect with him, or you want him to share anything else with you from his session, I encourage you to please share it with your academic advisors. They will then share your questions with me, and I can forward it to Professor Barkan, and we can see how we can arrange a discussion with him, maybe another call, or if that's not possible, he's always willing to be there for us through emails as well. So I encourage you to please take that opportunity that he's offered for us. And also, I just want to remind you that a bibliography of all the readings from Columbia University has been shared with everyone earlier. I think that email, let me just confirm the date of that email. Yes. So that particular bibliography has been shared to everyone on the 10th of February through email. I encourage you to please go through it and please read the articles. And if you have any questions for the professors when they come for class based on those articles, you can always have your questions prepared. Then they can answer your questions for you, because I think most of us may not be really aware of some topics, may be new to us, but if we read, I think that will prepare us for the class and have our doubts cleared. Sometimes the professors may not be able to cover everything in class, because these classes are for very short duration. 3 hours, 2 hours is never enough for a professor to cover everything, but reading will actually really help us. So encourage you to please go through it as well. The readings that are in English, and there's some readings that are in Spanish, and translation may not be possible, because these are they have the writers copyright. So we may not always be able to translate these readings for you. But what I found it to be very useful is the Google Translate. Sometimes these articles are online and they're not in PDF form, and I think we can make use of Google Translate to help us with the language. So that is all from my end, but I would like to just hear from you. How have you been adapting to the sessions so far? We've just wrapped up. Today we wrap up our second week, and any kind of concerns that you want, or doubts that you have, that we can clarify. Now, I'd just like to open that space for you. So anyone, please just unmute yourselves and go ahead. Or if you feel that it's been fine so far, it's been well, also please let us know.
Yeah, it's been good. I on Friday or for the Thursday sessions, which is Friday for me, or the Friday sessions, which are at midnight for me. This day specifically is always pretty difficult because it starts at midnight and then goes until like 3 in the morning. So it's a little bit hard for me to I have to really push myself to stay up for
Yeah.
these days. So the time difference has been a little bit just like I have to get used to it. But other than that, I've enjoyed the sessions. I think I feel like everybody's still getting into the groove of um discussion and kind of initiating that. But I feel like today we're getting closer to the rhythm of just using the space and kind of being a little bit more assertive and jumping into the conversation. I think mostly everyone, it feels like we usually are waiting to see and give other people a chance to speak. But I think now we're learning how to just jump in and get the conversation going. Um, uh, yeah.
Thank you, Bon. I know, right? The time difference, I think it's a challenge for all of us, but I really appreciate that everyone is making an effort to be at class and to be here. So thank you, and thank you for your feedback as well, Bon. I hope we continue to be active. Juliana, please go ahead.
Sí, muchas gracias. Bueno, yo agradezco mucho por el
Yes, thank you so much. I am very grateful for the process that we are developing. It is really interesting. But I have some questions concerning the times for classes. I looked at the program from the university specifically, so I had the university times, their topics, but I don't know whether it is me, but the other days, the other schedules, to be able to make sure that I'm always there and not miss any classes and be attuned to the specific schedules, not just for the days of the university, but the other days in particular.
Yeah. Carmen, did Juliana ask about the timings for the other days, like Mondays and Wednesdays?
Let me ask her. I believe she's asking about, she's saying that she can follow the schedule for the Fridays, but maybe not so much for the two. Let me clarify, please, your question.
Okay.
Joy, I just translated your question.
Yes, Juliana. Juliana, can you please repeat your question?
Lo que les decía la compañera con respecto a los horarios.
Yeah, Lucia says that about the schedules, she just wanted to make a comment that on the topics, unfortunately, Lucia's sound is breaking up. The schedules.
Gracias.
Okay. I think I understood. I think Hapin, just please help me out in this. I think Juliana is saying that she can follow the sessions of Columbia University, but not so much of the other sessions, right? And I think I know where the confusion
Sí,
is.
ahorita corroboro. Sí, disculpen, sí,
Yes,
ahorita
I'm
estoy
sorry. Now I'm now checking that this information went to my spam, so I couldn't find the information in relation to the schedules. It went to my spam folder. I only
Okay.
had the information from the university, but not the rest. So I was confused by that. But now that they said that you had shared that, I had looked in my spam folder and I found it. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliana. So just to confirm, the Columbia University seminars are also part of the overall FEMI calendar, which I have shared through the Google Drive link. So you will find these seminars inside the overall calendar of the school, where through the Google link that I've earlier shared, um, I think Juliana had a confusion because I had also shared a separate PDF just for Columbia University because Professor Elsa wanted that to be shared. But okay, Juliana, I'm glad that you found the link. So for everyone, just to clarify again, on Fridays we have Columbia University sessions which will begin every Friday at 8 a.m. and will continue till 11 a.m. There'll be days like today, we do not have a full class session with the professor. So we had just about 1 hour and a half with Professor Barkan today, and then we had Tanya who continued on. So there may be instances like that as well in the other Friday sessions, but we will have Columbia University every Friday, even if it's not for a complete 3 hours. But Professor Elsa and other experts from Columbia University will be there on every Friday at 8 a.m. On Mondays, the classes will begin at 6 a.m. Guatemala time, and on Wednesdays, 8 p.m. Guatemala time. Uh, on Wednesdays, the classes are a little shorter, which is just for 2 hours. But however, I encourage you to keep checking the calendar as well. And if there's any changes, you will get your information via the calendar. As of now, there's been no changes to the timings. But as we go along, we might just have changes in the timings. For example, the previous day, I think Sandra Creamer had to be with us for 2 hours, but she couldn't be there with us because she had an emergency. So she had to wrap up her class a little short. But in situations like that, we will carry forward these discussions and these classes through group exercises, and it may not always be possible for us to give you updates of the calendar because sometimes experts would let us know just 5 minutes or 10 minutes before class that they will not be present um, throughout the entire duration. But I encourage you to just check your Google Calendar again, just in case there's a change in timings. But we will inform you if there is. Anima says, you said you sent something on 10th Feb. Could you perhaps send it again? The group maybe because I checked my email. It looks like I couldn't find it. Okay, Anima. It's the bibliography that I had sent. The list of readings. I'll send that in WhatsApp group again. Yeah. Juliana still has her hand up. I hope I answered. Juliana, please go ahead. Do you have another question? Okay, I think we're going over time now. If there's no more questions, should we wrap up? Sister Orte?
Bueno, muchas gracias, Joy. Gracias a todas.
Thank you,
Y
Joe. Thank you, everyone. We've gone over a few minutes, but thank you for your patience. And of course, always to the interpreters and the entire FEMI team who make this possible. Happy weekend to all. Enjoy the time with your families. We'll see you on Monday at 6 a.m. Guatemala time. See you on Monday.